Hello, I'm Goat King. Welcome to the realm. Today, I want to talk about making a dungeon map. Something I've noticed when I'm playing tabletop RPGs, and it's a little weird. I never really remember the dungeon. I remember a few moments here and there, a few things that my party did that were interesting, and yes, glad to have those memories. But I'd love to remember the dungeon too. I want the dungeon itself to be a memorable experience to a player. And I thought, where else do we have memorable experiences in dungeons? And my answer to that was in the Zelda games. They're very well known for their interesting and flavorful dungeons, and they're very memorable. So I wanted to take some of the things we can learn from Zelda dungeons and put them inside of a tabletop RPG dungeon. Personally, I'm going to be using Pathfinder 2nd edition for this video. And that's just the fantasy tabletop RPG that I typically play. I'm familiar with the rules. That's the fantasy tabletop RPG of choice for me. Although what I'm planning to discuss here should be applicable in pretty much any RPG, even ones that are not fantasy. You should be able to apply these traits and techniques to sci-fi and survival horror. Should be able to apply it to pretty much anything. Now, what do we get most in a Legend of Zelda dungeon? So the basics of a Zelda-style dungeon that we're going to try to match. That there is a small challenge before you can enter the dungeon. There are many puzzles as well as challenges that are isolated to just rooms. There are plenty of enemies, but they're typically very low threat enemies. There is a gimmick or a way that you can restructure the dungeon. There are multiple different ways that doors can be impassable, and one type that's iconic to Zelda dungeons is one-use key doorways. There is a mini-boss that'll give you an artifact either needed to help traverse the dungeon or to defeat the final boss. There is a challenge that you must overcome in order to get a key item to open the door to the final boss. And there is a final boss who is typically multi-stage and very strong. Afterwards, you can get your MacGuffin and leave the dungeon. There are also some things to avoid about Zelda dungeons. They are things that they only work because it's single player, because it's in a video game, because it's single player and it's in a video game. There are a lot of puzzles in Zelda that are pushing blocks around. That's not interesting when you're playing it in a tabletop RPG. Unless you have like actual physical puzzles that you can hand your players, maybe you could use those in place of a room puzzle. You say, okay, here's the puzzle of this room. Obviously, it's bigger and you have to work together to move it around, but solve this puzzle and the room will open up. The room will be completed. If you don't have those, you can't use those simpler puzzles. Lighting a torch, pushing blocks. Now, that's not to say that you can't use something about lighting torches, or that you can't use something involving blocks, but it needs to be more themed towards being in a tabletop RPG, not just a video game. Another thing that's common in Zelda games is traversal. Very commonly, there will be a tool you get in the dungeon that allows you to traverse it better, or changes the way you move. That's probably not going to work. If you have a party of adventurers, it's entirely reasonable to think one of them is going to be able to fly. One of them is going to be able to climb walls. Few of them might be decent at swimming. These aren't things you can rely on locking behind puzzles and then incorporating later. These are things that are a part of the game as is. Another thing, locking doors with keys. If you have a rogue in the party, that's not going to work. If you make the DCs too difficult for him to reliably pick, then he's going to feel like, then the player, if you make the DCs too difficult for a rogue to reliably pick to get the doors open, the player isn't going to feel like they're playing their character. They're going to feel railroaded because they don't get to use the abilities that they were excited for when they made the character. So we need to come up with other solutions. We need to cater to the abilities of our players. So, for instance, instead of having a door with a key lock, you can use something that bars the way, and then you need to go find the mechanism that runs it, and then the thief can use their abilities on that. You get to lock the door behind. You get to lock a door. You get to restrict the player's movement through your dungeon and force them down different paths. But it allows the thief, the rogue, or whoever may have decided they want to be good at picking locks to do that task. Bars come over the door. You can't pick bars. But you can go down another pathway and you can find the mechanism that runs it. And you know, if you don't have a rogue in the party, if you don't have someone that's good at disabling devices, you can put a puzzle here to run that mechanism. If you do, this is an old dungeon. It's been here probably for a great many years. The mechanism might be broken. Whatever used to be the way to open it might just not work anymore. It needs a thieves' touch. Someone who can operate it in ways that wasn't originally intended. And there you go. Now your thief still gets to open the door. You can put it behind an encounter or a puzzle. In this video, we're going to create an outline of a dungeon design. This will be a small example. And in the next few videos, I will go over the different parts of the dungeon in more detail. The theme for this dungeon is going to be the Ancient King's Treasury. It takes place underneath a destroyed castle in a hidden mechanized treasury. It's fantasy, and we're playing Pathfinder 2nd edition. One little note I'd like to go over before we begin is it's helpful to use one DC for the various thievery and perception checks that you'll use throughout the dungeon. That way it's easier to remember, and you don't need to take time every time a player asks if they can do something to try to figure out what DC you're. In this case, using the table in the core rulebook, on page 503, we find that a DC by level 9, 26 is a decent DC. So that is the DC we will use for this dungeon. So we have, very front, we'll have an entrance. There'll be a lot of cover, and we are going to use a Shambler troop. We will use a Shambler troop as the guard to the dungeon. This is a large group of zombies that act as one, and as you get its hit point pool down, it grows smaller. That'll bring us into the first room once we get past them, and in there we will encounter a skeletal giant. The reason we're doing this specifically is so that we can immediately introduce the way that we're going to work one-use keys and key doors in this dungeon. Given that this is a tabletop RPG with rogues, using normal locks doesn't really work. Don't get me wrong, we will have various kinds of locks, and we will definitely make sure that there are options for rogues to use their abilities so that they can feel useful and feel powerful playing the character they designed. We don't want them to feel left out. But in this case, we want to introduce our key doors. These are doors that have one-use resources to open them. In this case, since it's the ancient king's treasury, we're going to open them with money, specifically gold pieces from the ancient king. This is going to work very much like a gumball machine, and if you put the wrong coin in, or a modern coin, and you try to turn it, it'll only go halfway, and you can retrieve the coin. That way players aren't sitting there wondering, how much money do I need to put in here before it opens? 50 gold in before they realize they should be using the special gold. Once they put the special gold in, it will open, and it will consume the gold. We're going to mark our key doors as a square with a little circle in there. The next chamber we have is the central chamber of this particular dungeon. And in here we have our puzzle box gimmick, if you will. We have 3 doors on the far wall and a moving staircase that can be moved to each one. In the middle, we have an ornate door with gears built in. This will be our boss door, which will require a special key to get in. On the other side, we will have another coin door, one-use key door. And on this side, we will have one that is barred. So it will require a lever or puzzle somewhere else in the dungeon to be solved before we can enter it. On either side here, we have open hallways. In the main chamber, there's no mechanism to control the stair, and the stair starts facing the boss door. That way the players can go to the boss door and discover that they need something in order to open it. In our case, the boss door will be clockwork. And there will be a crank that moves several of the gears and makes it apparent that there is a missing gear that will need to be provided in order to get the door to fully open. When we go this way, we find a magical altar with various handles around it, and it is too stiff to move. There's a hollow in the center of it. It looks like maybe a special stone will fit. When we go up, there will be an open doorway that will become barred once the players go through, because this will be a combat trial. And in this one, we will use hunting spiders. We're going to use a decent number of them. This isn't the mini-boss, so it isn't going to be too tough, but it will still need to be done before the players can access the next room. So that door is barred. Once they get to the next room, this will be a puzzle room. In this room, I'm going to try something interesting. There is a dice with writing, and if any of them can decipher the writing, they will find out that the stone set in this dice is a generator of sorts, but it requires magical energy. Specifically, it requires 7 spell levels worth of magical energy. Now, this can be provided as multiple spells or a single 7th level spell. However, since this is for a 9th level party, they won't have access to 7th level spells, and they will have to spend multiple spells in order to charge this stone, which can then be carried back to motorize this rotating altar. That will allow them to turn the staircase to face any individual door, though these doors are all still locked. If they go this way, they will find a chamber where they will fight 2 zombie hulks. And once they do, they will find a decent but small amount of treasure on either of them, as well as a golden coin from the old king, from the ancient king, which can, if you remember, be spent at this door. This door will take them to a chamber where they will fight the mini-boss of the dungeon. The mini-boss will be a clockwork soldier and clockwork mage. Now, this will be much more difficult than all the fights they've previously fought, but it should still be well within their abilities, even given their lowered number of spell slots and their various fights. Once they have completed this chamber, they will be able to take an artifact that they can use to defeat the final boss. And they can trigger a clockwork mechanism set into this wall, which will unlock the barred door in the main chamber. Coming back and moving the staircase, in the next chamber they'll find, there will be a barred door to a smaller chamber and a pressure plate, along with various murals along the wall depicting thieves being hung, crucified, and in various ways tortured. The largest of the group will need to stand upon the pressure plate in order to open the bars. And if he steps off, the bars will close. In this room, sitting upon a dais, there is a clockwork cog, one that appears as if it would fit within the boss door. Once the players pick up the cog that will unlock the boss door, a skeletal Hulk will drop into the room and begin to attack the player standing upon the pressure plate. Again, if the player leaves the pressure plate, then the bars will close. All the players need to get out of this room before they abandon the pressure plate. After defeating the Skeletal Hulk, they will be free to move back into the main chamber, return the bridge to the boss door, and go to the boss battle. In the boss battle chamber, they will find a clockwork dragon sitting upon the king's hoard, surrounded by web. The clockwork dragon has not been wound in a great while, and it does not seem to be functioning. If any of the players touch but a single web, a giant tarantula will crawl out from behind the clockwork dragon and attack. This giant tarantula is the first stage of the boss fight. When it reaches half health, it will scream out, and from below the pile of treasure, a Goliath spider will crawl out to continue the battle. Depending on whether your players took the time to rest and recoup their spells and hit points before entering the boss chamber, you may need to reduce the strength of both the giant tarantula and Goliath spider by reducing their DCs and checks by 2. Once your players have defeated the giant spiders, they may take from the hoard whatever they can carry and search for the MacGuffin. Keep an eye out for my future videos where I will go through each individual room and how they work in more detail, along with the monsters and a rundown on how they will likely fight and attack the players. Thank you very much. Have a great day.